Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the latest edition of Freethought Hour. Slightly late compared to the normal schedule, but never mind. We had a technical hitch and we've solved it. This is another attempt at reverse colonization, I'm afraid. We have another invasion of South Africans, starting with Tercia. How the devil are you,
Yes,
Tercia?
I am excellent. I'm doing really well. My nerves are shot because Ireland is playing the All Blacks as we speak. I think they have halftime now. And
Yeah,
from a South African point of view, this is the Rugby World Cup. It would be much
yeah.
better, in my opinion, if the All Blacks lost against Ireland. And if we don't win the World Cup, I really, really do hope that Ireland takes it. So it's a double invasion. But
Okay,
I'm doing really well,
good,
sacrificing
good.
rugby to be here.
And you won't have to face Wales, as they were
No,
narrowly kicked out. Yes.
nice
Okay.
game.
And our other South African tonight is, I'm going to try and say it, Gijsbert. Hugendorn. Yeah.
You did good, John. Can I try? Can I do it properly?
Okay. Okay. Good.
So, our guest, if you can put him on, is Gijsbert Hogendoren, which
Ooh.
literally translated means high thorn, the surname at least. Gijsbert, I don't know what that means. Gijsbert is a professor in tourism geography at the University of Johannesburg. He is also the younger brother of my very best friend from my childhood days, and I see that his nephew is with us, and I see that my brother has joined the show as well. So we have some family members watching us, and I would like to say hello to hopefully my friend Cornelia if she watches this in future, and to her dad and your dad Gijsbert, in whose home I grew up. But that's not why we're talking tonight. We are talking about a tourism geographer, and we had some technical problems, and you began to explain to us what a tourism geographer does. So can you just repeat that very quickly and tell us what you focus on and what is why a tourism geographer?
Okay, so thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity. So I'm a geographer who studies tourism. So in other words, I study the geography of tourism. So geography, you study space and time, what happens on planet Earth, and from a spatial perspective and over time. So you can study economic geography, where you look at how economics play out in a spatial sense. Over space and time, you can look at politics, how things change over time in different places. Same with social geography, historical geography, and I study specifically the geography of tourism, mostly in southern Africa.
So
Go
I
ahead, John.
know. Sorry, I know that geography is a sort of a ragbag subject, isn't it? It dips into lots of other skills, lots of other fields of endeavor. And I was telling my earlier people that my daughter recently had to choose, and I advised her to choose to continue to study geography because we can't avoid it. We all live on a planet. It's got a surface. There's activity going on there. Not all of it is human generated. We're at the mercy of the forces of nature. And so it's a good subject to study to find out more about where you live. And she's carried on. She's followed my advice. It's unusual, but she followed my advice.
Good. I'm glad she did. So geography is essentially interdisciplinary study. Long before it became a popular word or a key phrase or something that people became very interested in, geographers have been studying how the physical space and human space all interact for probably over 200 years. Officially, Alexander von Humboldt is probably the father of geography. It's interdisciplinary studies. Just before it was called interdisciplinary studies. So yeah, it's a good subject if you want to know a lot of things about a lot of things. Yeah.
I see. My brother is making a comment here. He's a high school geography teacher in the UAE in Abu Dhabi, and he says he believes it's the single most important subject for school kids to get exposed to as much as possible. And I never thought I'd find myself saying this, but being a teacher and being an English teacher who teaches a little bit, a smattering of basic mathematics, I would have to agree that if I have to select only 3 subjects for children to learn at school, up to, say, grade 12 level, it would be obviously language, because if you can read, learn anything, and if you can understand what you're reading, and if you can write, you can do basically anything. But you need the basics of maths, and you also, if you need geography, because if you dig into geography properly, it is, like you said, Gijsbert, it's interdisciplinary to the greatest extent, because history comes into it, and then economics comes into it, and then you get the hard physical, the physical science, the physics and chemistry comes into it as well. I mean, the ages of rocks, dating things, politics comes into it. And I'm curious, what was the one thing that made you interested in choosing geography as a subject at school? Because I know that very few children in South African high schools, at least, actually do take geography as a subject. I know of schools in Worcester where often there are no matrics in a particular year who have geography as a subject. What was it that made you choose geography as your subject of choice?
Well, it was definitely my father. My father was, he's a musician. He was a classical musician, but he was someone who reads and still does, reads incessantly. He reads at least a book a week, I would say. It doesn't matter if it's this thick or this thick. Yeah, and he was always telling me stories about different, or giving me different accounts about history from all over the world, and explained how things played out differently. And also, I'm essentially the son of an immigrant, there was always these comparisons between how it was in the Netherlands versus how it was in South Africa. So I think mostly him being sort of constantly telling me about his reading and where he gained an understanding of other places as an honorary historian, if you want to put it that way. But also they often at home, they told us about the overseas trip that they did. I mean, they only probably did about two or three trips in their life. Things have changed significantly since then. Yes. But they told me about their overseas trip as these extremely magical experiences, going to Rome, going to the Vatican, going to the Champs-Élysées in Paris, obviously the Netherlands, England, places like that. So they certainly triggered my sort of hunger or thirst to understand other places, but it was sort of really sprinkled with their travels overseas. So that really triggered my desire to understand other places, other people.
Travel broadens the mind, doesn't it? I remember visiting the middle of America some years ago, about 20 years ago, and we met a lovely lady there. This was Michigan. So it was she lived in one of those places that's named after a town you find in The Simpsons. One of whatever it's called.
Springfield.
Yes, Springfield. That's right. She lived in one of those. Well, there are lots of Springfields in America, but she lived in Springfield, Indiana. No, Idaho. I can't remember. But the thing is that she had only ever traveled to her nearest town. We were on a journey. We were driving past St. Louis, on our way to Las Vegas, I think. But she said I must go there one day. And she'd never been beyond the neighboring shopping center, and this generates such a parochial attitude, narrow-mindedness. And
so the thing is, travel to be lucky enough to travel means that you do have some access to resources, and in other words, you are sort of in the 1%, in the top 1% to travel. So it's a very privileged thing to be able to do, and these days we've also realized that it's extremely damaging to the world to do travel because of carbon emissions. But I think what's been very beneficial for traveling is that traveling sort of knocks ignorance out of the body, if I can put it that way.
It does.
You gain a amazing understanding that you just wouldn't be able to do from reading. I was lucky enough to be in Osaka in Japan in April, and you go there, and when you land, you're extremely jet lagged. But when you land in Osaka and you take your first couple of steps into the street, you're like, okay, this is different than I thought. So I think it's a very privileged perspective, but you do learn so much more by traveling than you would by reading. I would obviously suggest that you do read and travel. You can't just do one or the other, but that's...
Gijsbert, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of traveling. Travel doesn't have to involve getting onto a plane and traveling overseas. And I grew up in Freithought in northern KZN, where you were born there, if I'm not mistaken. But you were 1 year
about the place, but I was born there. Yes,
you were born there, but you were one. You were one when you relocated to Cape Town. So I spent my entire youth in Freithought, and then I lived on the east coast of South Africa, and about 12 years ago, we relocated to the Western Cape. And something that has struck me living in the Western Cape that's very different from living in KZN. We used to travel locally in South Africa. We would travel to Johannesburg, to Bloemfontein, not regularly, but at least a couple times a year. We would also travel about 200-300 kilometers sometimes for sport events in that area of South Africa. So we traveled quite a lot in our region and in our country. So from Freithought to Johannesburg is about 400 kilometers. But in the Western Cape, I've met people who live in Worcester, where I live now, who have never been beyond the Orange River. And it strikes me that I find really odd, because I know South Africa is a big country, and the bigger the country gets, even to travel within one's own country becomes cumbersome. I mean, the first time I went to the Cape Province was when I was 14. So I understand what you say about traveling, but when you live in a country that is quite large, so South Africa is quite a large country compared to a country like the UK. But even in the UK, to just go from London to Yorkshire, or where John lives on the east coast.
Don't tell everybody where I live.
Okay, well, it's on the other side. It's on it's by the channel. It's on the channel side. and just even and I mean, it's a 3-hour train journey from Yorkshire to London, but it's still so different. And the to experience the geography on an island as small as the UK, when you travel, it's essential that people travel even in the localities. And I want to ask you about what tourism involves, and how tourism, what distinguishes tourism from travel. I'm curious about, is there a distinction, and what is it that causes the distinction?
Okay, so formally, the United Nations has got this extremely long definition of what a tourist could entail. But essentially, it's anybody that spends more than a couple of hours. You can say 12 hours to 24 hours if you want to, but I can make all kinds of other claims that it doesn't even have to be that. But it's essentially spending time outside of one's own residence or own home environment. Or so how you define that would depend on person to person. So to give you an example, that we all understand the classical tourist being someone from the UK going to Mallorca in Spain, or to southern France, or South Africans going to Mauritius, or the Germans going to Sweden, and the Russians going to Finland, and Americans going to Florida. We all understand that as your typical types of tourism. People that go on holiday for leisure purposes or for recreation, but you get all kinds of different types of tourism. Backpacker tourists, you get volunteer tourists, you get cultural tourists, creative tourists, heritage tourists, second home tourists, business tourists, religious tourism. Because essentially it's any form of movement outside of your normal place of residence, usually entailing some kind of recreational aspect.
Yes, I would have said it was leisure travel rather than work travel, where you get an opportunity to enjoy where you are.
Yeah, but people will, for example, go on business to, say, Johannesburg to London, and maybe 8 to 5 is work, but after hours they're still exploring London. So they're still, so they're not a pure leisure tourist, but they may perhaps a partial leisure tourist. So
it's so interesting how there's this definition, and it just, I've always been curious. I mean I've known what you do for some time, but now I'm really even more curious. But before I ask another question, I'm keen to answer my brother's question, because it touches upon something that we briefly mentioned in the live stream that wasn't live, and that concerns the environment and climate change, which you are convinced is real. We've had conversations on here with people who don't think they think it's real, but it's not caused by humans, which is, maybe if you are keen, we could talk about that. But I want to ask about, my brother says, how can environmental, I'm not wearing my glasses, environmentally aware people reconcile the effect we have on the planet with the benefits of traveling? And should we stop traveling, or should we travel in different ways, or should we still fly? Do I have to feel guilty if I fly to Brighton to attend an event that John is going to sponsor me for?
Yeah, if we get into that, we would need to open up the climate change debate fully, though.
Yes.
That's fine. I don't know if John, we've gone there. I mean, we're not afraid, are we?
No, I don't mind which direction this conversation takes, as long as it's interesting. But there are a number of cans of worms here, because we've just talked a bit about the benefits of traveling, how it broadens the mind, and you get to encounter people that you wouldn't otherwise bump into, and so you start to wonder about their views as well as your own personal egocentric opinions, and that, I think, is all very beneficial, because it's empathic, it's social, and this is what social animals like us should be doing in order to succeed. We need to cooperate, and that means trade, and so the whole thing it's indescribably good for humanity and the planet in terms of improvement. But there is this downside, isn't there? And I think we don't want to. I think it's pretty much agreed now, accepted, that anthropogenic climate change is a real phenomenon. And what we've got to do now is face it and try and think of some way of overcoming the worst of it. So what do you think about that, Gijsbert?
So I always find it very interesting when people say, do you believe in climate change or not? It's like, well, it doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. It's not a belief system.
Indeed.
It's a fact. It's just science. It's like some people, I guess, do, but nobody questions gravity.
Yes.
Or you can try. It's not going to end up well.
Depends on the height you test it from.
Yeah, I mean, you can, and yeah, sure, you could people who think the Earth is flat, but that's just whether you think it's flat or not doesn't mean it's anything else than that. So, essentially, yes, you get normal climate change processes where we do go through warming and cooling periods naturally, but I mean, the evidence is absolutely overwhelmingly the case that human beings, since the start of the first industrial revolution, has produced carbon emissions that's caused anthropogenic climate changes that causes all kinds of effects, such as global warming, which ultimately causes global environmental change and is leading to rather severe situations. I mean, the Cape Province was subject to massive floods a couple of weeks ago. That's not technically climate change, but these are sort of examples of things that will occur.
Extreme weather is probably got a climate change component.
Oh, absolutely. Wildfires in Australia a couple of years ago was absolutely extreme. So these extreme, although extreme events are a normal part of how the natural environment functions, it's become more intense, more extreme. And the problem is we have 8 billion people on the planet now, so it affects quite a lot of people quite quickly.
Yes,
and tourism contributes to this problem. So I think, if I remember correctly, tourism contributes about up to 7% of greenhouse gases.
I think I've heard that figure too. From jet flight mostly.
Mostly, yeah. So it's not. It's so tourism isn't necessarily the biggest contributor, but it has a role to play. And yes, so there's. I've been lucky to travel quite far or fairly far and fairly wide. But I am increasingly thinking, do I need to travel to certain places? Is it an absolute necessity? Is there a real benefit to me traveling? So to be able to justify the carbon emissions, do I fly there or do I fly there? But also at the same time, there's a whole generation of suburbanites in Johannesburg that have grown up here that's never been to the inner city of Johannesburg.
Yes.
Ever. So for them to literally go 15 kilometers south of where they live now, they will probably be able to experience an environment more exotic, more interesting, more fascinating than flying to Amsterdam.
That's right. Well, but if you've been raised in Sandton,
exactly,
why would you want to go to the slums in the city centre? Eh?
Well, some of it is slum, some of it's not. You get some. That's the thing about the Johannesburg inner city; it's gigantic. You've got areas that are majority immigrants from the subcontinent. So if you want Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi food, is probably one of the best places to go. But then you've got places that are literal vertical slums that are not very safe to go to. But then you've got the banking cities, the areas that are completely controlled. So, you could experience, that's the benefit of South Africa, is that you can experience an extreme amount of diversity within a 10-kilometer radius that you probably wouldn't experience in any other city in the world.
Yes.
And then so I want to ask about this, the effect of climate change. Obviously, climate change will also affect how tourism works, because as probably the climate warms, more people will be fine to spend their summers in the UK instead of going to Greece or Mallorca, because there it's too hot in any case, and it's too dry, and they can't take nice showers because there's not enough water. And then if one imagines the the sort of
Sea level.
exponential effect of changing travel patterns. So
Yeah,
people might end up not going to the Maldives anymore because the Maldives will be underwater, and you could only go there if you have a boat. And does being a tourism geographer involve investigating new avenues of tourism, and how does that tie into obviously economics plays a part as well as political stability. I mean, if there's political instability, then people won't travel because it's not safe. So maybe I'm circling back to this whole idea that what you do is extremely interdisciplinary, because it involves so many disparate factors, some directly caused by humans and others more indirectly caused by humans. So could you talk to that a little bit, please?
Before you do, I want to bring something to this table, because I listened to a travel show. I listen to Radio 4 a lot. And there was a travel show last week that it featured hoteliers in southern Spain. And they were saying that they feared for the future because these 40-degree temperatures they drive people away. You don't want to go to a country that's at 40 degrees. So they're looking at shifting their periods of busy season to the extreme ends, so they're expecting to be busy in the autumn and the spring, but deserted in the summer.
So can I quickly do a shameless plug?
Go ahead.
So here's a book that I wrote with two wonderful colleagues, Jarkko Saarinen from Northern Finland and Jennifer Fitchett from Wits University. It's called Climate Change and Tourism in Southern Africa. And essentially, this is just where we explore exactly those issues, but in the Southern African context. So we look at Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, Mozambique, Eswatini, Lesotho, the South Indian Ocean islands like Mauritius, Seychelles, Reunion, etc. And so there's two avenues that you can focus on. One is called adaptation. How do we adapt to things that are happening? And one is mitigation. In other words, how do we stop climate change from happening or exacerbating to a point that is uncontrollable? And it's going to become uncontrollable, in my view. It's inevitable.
Looks likely, doesn't it? Yes, we haven't reacted quickly enough.
Yeah, we're just not reacting because people react to crises. They don't react to sound advice. So we looked a lot at adaptation. So, for example, a couple of things that will happen. I mean, in Europe, for example, you'll see probably tourism increasingly going more northwards. Where people used to go to Italy or Spain or Portugal or Greece, they may actually be going to the North Sea, or they'll be going to the Gulf of Finland or the Gulf of Bothnia, where the impacts of climate change will not be as severe. I mean, if I think about my dear friends and colleagues in northern Sweden, I mean, they live 400 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle. They always joke with me, like they say that summer is the best week of the year. So if they get to 2-3 weeks of summer a year, it'll just be fantastic for them.
Yes.
But the reality is, in places like South Africa, severe drought, extreme heat, the socioeconomic fallout of that is going to be much more extreme than in places like Sweden or Finland, where you've got well-functioning state entities, and the consequences of climate change will not be as severe.
I want to ask you about the book that you just plugged, and you can do that again. And I think John will put the title on the screen for us as well. I want to ask you, and I always tell my kids that I teach that there's no such thing as a stupid question. I do feel a little bit stupid asking this question, but where is the dividing line of Southern African countries? Is just to get the picture. So we have South Africa, then we have Lesotho and Swaziland or Eswatini, and then we have Namibia, and then we have Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Malawi is sort of, am I right? What am I missing? And then Zambia.
So you can do it in two ways. You can talk about the Southern African Development Community, which includes all the way up to Angola, Zambia, Tanzania, Democratic Republic of the Congo. But Southern Africa is generally understood to be Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Eswatini, Lesotho, South Africa.
Right. So not Kenya. Kenya is Middle Africa.
Kenya is Eastern Africa. East Africa.
Yeah, but I'm in a north and south sense. Is it sort of above the south, but below the equatorial bit? And you see, Congo, I would have thought Congo was solidly equatorial.
Well, Congo is only about 2,000 kilometers from Johannesburg.
Yeah, but doesn't the equator go through it?
It's a giant country.
Yes,
it does.
So
yes.
That's what Devon, my brother, was saying earlier about how limited most people's just basic knowledge of geography is. And I pride myself that I actually take an interest in getting to know countries and getting to know maps and places. But even I find that when I have to think about maps and where things fit in, I get lost sometimes, even in my own region. But it's very interesting what you say, John, also, and this whole conversation, that just, it's fascinating how we define things and how we categorize things. So you said SADC is the more political grouping of Southern African, or what the term was. And then from a geographical point of view, there's another grouping, and how that might also change. How countries are grouped together might also change due to something like climate change, because you might get different categories of countries where people typically would normally go in the European summer, and now they might go in the European winter. They might rather prefer to travel because so those patterns might change, and all the role on effects of that. I want to ask about something that you mentioned when you spoke about the different kinds of tourism, and you mentioned volunteer tourism. And thinking of Southern Africa and the poverty and the social issues we have, is there an increase? Have you noticed, is there any research that shows an increase in volunteer tourism, where people come to do volunteer work and they stay for 2 or 3 months and they make a contribution while they experience the country? Have you picked up anything like that?
So I can't talk about increases or decreases per se, because South African tourism will only really determine how many people come in and how many people go out. So they don't necessarily just say, I am a volunteer tourist.
Okay.
But you get all kinds of volunteer tourists in Southern Africa. And Namibia, people love to volunteer at a cheetah sanctuary or at a lion sanctuary or a rhino sanctuary, or all that. Or people will also come to South Africa. There are people who do volunteer work at orphanages in Johannesburg, and that's benefit. There's all kinds of good and bad to this. For example, you can have a place where people volunteer with wildlife, but at the same time, the problem is there's an interest then to have vulnerable animals that requires care. And the thing is, what's brilliant about volunteer tourism from a business perspective, these people pay you to do free labor. I mean, there's few better business models than that. So the problem is that there is potentially an interest in having vulnerable animals that needs to be looked after to make money. But at the same time, some people do really good work and do really support and help and achieve these things. But there's also issues around sort of paternalistic attitudes about coming to save the poor Africans that require the help because we are so pathetic we can't look after ourselves. So there's all kinds of sort of things that you can play off from each other when it comes to volunteer tourism. But yeah, but tourism has increased massively across the world, though. I mean,
Yes.
if you had to think about mobility of people, if you go post-war, 1945, people that traveled immigrated. They didn't travel otherwise. If you were in the UK, you may have gone to Blackpool. That's it.
Right.
So, and if you're in the Netherlands, you may have gone to the beach. That's 50 kilometers away maximum. These days, people travel quite extensively. It's more wealthy people, but our levels of mobility is extreme.
Yeah, I blame the jumbo jet, which made it economic. It was anybody could afford to be on a flight.
I want to ask him, when was the word tourist coined? Do you know?
No, not exactly, but it's hundreds of years ago. Because remember, tourism is not a new thing at all.
Okay.
So pilgrimages.
Okay.
Yes.
The religious pilgrimages were essentially forms of tourism. In the Roman times, your elite would have had villas in the countryside outside of Rome, which they would have gone to visit for leisure purposes.
Would they have? I want to ask you: would they have referred to themselves as tourists, or would they just have been a traveler? And I'm asking this because the idea, and I think John mentioned this, and this is what's so interesting to me about talking to you. The picture in my mind of a tourist is somebody like I was last year for 3 weeks when we went to visit my brother Piet in Yorkshire, and we had to get our papers ready, and we packed our bags, and we got onto the plane, and we had an itinerary, and we worked it out, and that was what we were going to do. Or when my folks are going to visit the Khalkhadi Game Reserve in January next year, hopefully, that's my image of a tourist. And that's why I have this idea, and I think most people have this idea, that is what a tourist, it's somebody who goes on holiday. And that's why I'm asking, because the idea of of having a seasonal migration, for example, I mean, that's very old. You have that in all over the world, where people would take the cows to the summer fields and the winter fields and pasture. That's what I was looking for. But am I right if I say that the idea of traveling for holiday, just the idea of holiday, is quite a new idea? So specifically the idea of holiday, not so much the idea of traveling, because people have always traveled, but the idea of I'm going on holiday. Did this start around about the 60s? No. Air travel earlier?
It's post-industrial. Well, it's during the Industrial Revolution, when factory workers got cheesed off with never having a day off. And eventually weekends were introduced, bank holidays, and then a whole week in the summer to go away and have fun. And it became a fortnight. And some of the major factories shut down at specific times of the year, and everybody upped and went. And my early years were spent on the Isle of Wight, which at that time was a tourist destination. And so, in fact, my father had a business which was largely based on serving the visitors. And so we had an influx of people during the school holidays, basically, between the end of July and the beginning of September. The place was thronging with people who wanted to enjoy themselves. And that was because up north, their workplace physically closed down for 2 weeks. Said, go off, do something else.
So the thing is, Tasha, what I would say is mass tourism.
Yeah.
At the size that we know it now is something that's sort of post-45.
Yeah.
But tourism
existing. I'm not that old. This was post-45, yes.
Yeah. But I mean, as becoming a mass tourism phenomenon where literally 1 billion people travel a year, that is sort of something that's happened post-45, and it's increased every year. since. But
Yeah.
tourism existing in many forms in South Africa. I mean, your landlords here in Johannesburg had their holiday homes down at the KZN coast. Your sugarcane families, famous families, they had their places with their villas where they went to. But also at the same time, the impact of labor migration in South Africa, where people were sort of, essentially forced to come work on the mines. They would go home over Easter or go home over Christmas to go visit family during holiday and take a break. And that's tourism. It's a quite a basic form of tourism, and doesn't involve hotels and air conditioned rooms and all kinds of fancy dinners, but it's still a form of leisure.
So you talked about two ways of dealing with climate change. One was avoiding it by going elsewhere, and the other one was mitigating it. So what can we do? What's your view of carbon offsetting? This idea where if you burn so much fuel going on a flight, then you've got to plant a tree and hope that it doesn't catch fire. It seems to me like tax avoidance or tax evasion. It doesn't really cut the mustard in the way that you'd want.
So the reality for me is that climate change is essentially caused by industrialization, which is caused by capitalism, the creation of profit, the creation of wealth, and which has meant that we've created this environmental disaster. So by implementing carbon offsets, and I'll go travel there and I'll plant 10 trees. It's a market-based solution for a market-based problem.
Yes.
And that's basically, it doesn't work. It's like, yeah, it sounds okay, fight fire with fire, but that really isn't what's happening. You're going to have a major change in the way that we run economies and we do things that moves away from sort of your market-based approaches, which is, but I'm still going to do what I do as long as I give you this and I still make profit.
Has anybody thought of promoting this idea? So we spoke about volunteer tourism. I was driving through a part of town last week, and I just looked at all the plastic litter, and I think of the amount of plastic that I use in my household that I really try to avoid. I'm using much less than I have in the past. So do you think there's a chance of somebody pushing the idea of doing and what would the effect be of doing two things? And this is something that you mentioned, capitalism, consumerism, the fact that everybody believes that they must have 14 T-shirts in their cupboard. I don't think we need 14 T-shirts. I think 3 or 4 is more than sufficient. That's the one thing. And the other thing is I would like to see a time where people realize that we don't really need a holiday like the old time factory workers did, because very few people in the industrial world, and I'm talking middle class people like myself, our lives are so leisurely. We don't do physical hard labor. So people like myself should begin to think, and I'd like to hear your opinion, that a holiday would be better spent doing something that I don't normally do in a place that I'm not normally at. And if that means going to the beach, but being involved in a litter cleanup or a recycling project or something like that, and incorporating that into our idea of a holiday and of tourism, so that mass tourism becomes something that we think of as doing something different, but not just lying on the beach with suntan and plastic bottles all over all over
So,
the place.
so this is where there's an inherent contradiction when it comes to tourism. People do not want to be uncomfortable when they're on holiday.
No.
That's the whole point.
So,
Well, they
yeah.
don't ever want to be uncomfortable, do we? We always want to be comfortable.
But I mean,
More so when we're on holiday.
yeah, if you work, you're uncomfortable, but at least you get paid for it.
Okay.
Yeah. What you are proposing, Tessia, is known as community punishment in this country.
Okay, so it seems it's not going to fly. My type is not going to fly. Okay, okay, drop that idea.
It's just below jail.
No. It's community service for punishment.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the point is, the people that do volunteer tourism, it's not a huge market globally. It can't be. It's just not something people would do. But people are very prescriptive on how they want to volunteer. They want to volunteer with orphans because maybe playing with babies makes them happy, or if they're gonna feed rhinos, but they don't want to go do a litter cleanup. That's not really something that will.
Okay.
That's not fun. That's not something that will be fulfilling. And you won't necessarily learn anything, and you can't look in the eyes of the animal and become spiritual or something. I don't know, but it's still a product, and But I think what you may be hinting to is something called slow tourism, where people decide to approach their tourism in different ways. So instead of, for example, flying from Johannesburg to Cape Town, or from London to Mallorca, you may take a bicycle route slowly. Well, it has to be slowly because you're cycling. Say places that's closer by, but you may never have been to. But you can do it on a bicycle. So you get physical exercise, you may experience things. So those things are beneficial types of tourism that can be developed.
Yes.
You see, I knew there was a name for what I had in mind.
It's not quite a rubbish cleanup, but something like that, yeah.
Well, maybe you can get these cyclists or these people who do these, like the what's it, hiking route, that spiritual hiking in Spain. Maybe you can get these people to stop using as much plastic and
so there's something called greening of tourism. So I've done some research on green guest houses and green hotels, where, for example, the City Lodge Group in South Africa has done an amazing job now with installing solar panels, even before the energy cuts became as severe as it has in South Africa. So, but also increasingly they are implementing more environmentally friendly measures, low flow shower heads, developing the architecture of buildings differently, make it north facing or south facing rather than this.
Better insulation.
All those kinds of things are ways of limiting the damage of tourism, and that's happening in Zimbabwe. There's some very interesting examples of lodges that are now built sort of on the south side in very warm conditions, but to create natural cooling. All kinds of ways of greening your environment. Yeah,
building tower blocks like anthills. Yeah,
for example.
I want to ask about COVID. So sorry, John. I hope I didn't interrupt you, but has the tourism industry recovered from COVID? What do you think?
COVID was sort of seen in tourism circles as the Great Reset. To use the term one of my colleagues in Stellenbosch used, sort of the Great Reset, that we're going to now reset things. People are very much creatures of habit. So I think tourism is, for the most part, pretty much recovered everywhere, depending on the policy. I mean, China still had some quite strict COVID policies up until recently, if not still. When I went to Japan, there was quite strict measures still in place. But South African tourism is just about recovered, I think.
But
I mean, even if you look at at major events, 9/11, there was, I mean, major political turmoil, major changes, and tourism literally grew like this. And then 9/11 hit and made a little dip, and then just went on.
And it just went up. That's very interesting. That is really interesting.
It's the same with COVID. COVID was a bit more severe because the world went into a lockdown, but by 2021, things were firing again.
Normal. Yes. So during COVID, I think it was during COVID over here, we had something called the staycation, where you didn't go very far to go on holiday. You stayed at home and did your holiday very locally. So we need more of that, it seems.
But also what's happened is there's something called Zoom towns now, where people will have now moved away from living in cities and commuting every day to certain places. And they'll go live in the place where they have their holiday home, which could be George or Hermanus or Mossel Bay or wherever in the south coast of South Africa or wherever. And because they can work online, they go live there. And so that they live in their holiday environment anyway, so they don't feel the desire to go elsewhere anymore.
That is really interesting. I would like to just for a moment focus on Dean Kruger's question. Is it too late to turn the clock? And I think it is. That I wish I had any faith, or I just think it's too late. I think we've passed the tipping point. I don't think we can turn the tide on global warming and climate change.
So the thing is, I mean, thanks for your question, Dean. I think the thing is we can't think that way. That's not how we should be thinking. We shouldn't be thinking, oh, it's too late. Let's stuff up Earth. Let's go crazy. Let's just like pollute and just party. It's just not an way. It's not a way of thinking we should even be thinking about. What we should be doing is what can we do? And
so even though, so what you're saying, and I get you, and I think you're right, even though we can realize that we've probably passed the tipping point, it doesn't mean we should not adapt our behavior as much as we can globally, as much as we can.
It's a fair question to ask from an intellectual perspective. Have we gone too far, and should we be thinking about this from a nihilistic perspective? Yes, those are relevant philosophical questions to have, but from a behavioral perspective, in a world that needs effective governance, we shouldn't be thinking about those questions. It's rather about what can we do as quickly as possible, how and when, rather than screw it, it's too late.
Okay, so Gijsbert, quickly, should we travel? How should we travel? Where should we travel to? And what time of the year should we do it?
Come on, 5 seconds.
Anywhere where you've not been.
Yes.
Okay.
That's a good start. No, that's a very to speak of complicated questions. Out Mongolia would be great. Yeah.
Okay, wait, let me change tack a little bit. Where would you like to go where you have not been yet?
Iceland, Mongolia, and probably a place like Iran. I would say those three are probably on the top of it used to be Japan, but I was there earlier this year. So probably those three places would be really interesting to see.
Yeah.
Okay, and so it used to be Japan, and so can you give us a quick run through just geographically, where have you been besides all the major places? Obviously, do you prefer to go to the more off the beaten track types of places?
For sure. I mean, so I've been to the US, a couple of places in the US. I've been to Chile, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Hong Kong, Japan, Scotland, England, Netherlands, Belgium, France, Italy, Finland, Sweden, Namibia, Botswana, Eswatini recently, Lesotho, Mozambique, Mauritius.
Is this mostly as part of your work, or have you chosen the best job for being a tourism geographer?
Yeah, so I mean, some of it's been with work for sure. I'm going to a conference next year in Ireland. I've never been to Ireland. I went to Eswatini a couple of weeks ago with a student doing work on tourism development in Eswatini. But also, I mean, I've been to Indonesia with my wife, and been to Hong Kong with my wife, been to France and Italy with my wife. So some of it has just been in my house, but yeah.
I want to ask, I know it's maybe a difficult question, but just if you could briefly, what was the most fascinating place you visited? I mean, that includes, it might be a local place, maybe the inner city of Joburg. Where did you have the most transformative experience? Is it possible to answer that?
I'm not really that kind of person, but I don't have transformative experiences. But being South Africa is an incredible place to go. Whether you are South African or not, I think is that you can find many worlds in this place, no doubt about it. I mean, I've been to some fantastic places in South Africa where you drive for 8 hours and then you take a dirt road for another 60 kilometers, and then you take a turn off and you take another 20 kilometers of dirt road, and that dirt road becomes a little 2 tracks, and then those 2 tracks start disappearing, and then you get kilometers up, you get to a little old settler's house from the 1800s. There's just nobody there. And it's about as off the beaten track as you can get. And that's in South Africa. But I would say in terms of, for me, just in terms of overall experience, Indonesia is absolutely amazing. The food is fantastic. The people are incredible. People are so friendly, so warm. The history is extremely interesting because it's been there for, I mean, modern Indonesia has been not that old, but it's been there for thousands of years. Dutch colonization for 400 years. Wonderful weather. Yeah, Indonesia is just absolutely spectacular in my view. I love it. If I could go back now, I would. Climate change or not. But each place has got its own charm. But Indonesia is definitely top of my bucket list.
Well, I'm going to have to draw this to a close now, I'm afraid. Thank you very much. You've been wonderfully interesting. And I just want to promote next week's guest, who is a person that I've signed up. His name's Sasha. He's ethnically Russian, and he spent his childhood, I think, in Belgium. But he's been in the UK now for 15 years. And I've met him a couple of times because he's attended events that I've staged up and down the country. And he wants to get more involved. So I'm taking him to the Freethought Hour show next week so we can find out even more about Sasha. Yeah. And I'm going to let Dean have the last word here, because on his bucket list is this. Here you are, Dean.
I can't see. I have to. I want to be buried in a barrel of crude oil. Okay.
Yeah.
One way.
That's one way of doing it. So, Gijsbert, please don't leave us after the stream has ended, because we'll just stick around for another 5 minutes or so, and then we can watch the last of the rugby. My family's going crazy. I don't know what's happening with the New Zealand Ireland game, so I won't keep you long, I promise. John, it's been lovely to be with you again. I hope tomorrow will be better than last week for the views on the news. I'm terrible at that. Things have just been going crazy. Gijsbert, it was lovely to meet up with you. There's so many questions I'd still like to ask. Please spread the news far and wide and share the link. And a particular hello to your 13-year-old nephew. I hope he enjoyed the show as well.
Indeed. Say goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.